Hello and welcome to 949 Racing Supermiata. Today we're going to talk about our new Qmax Reroute. This is something we've been working on for several years. So this is the main adapter housing. We've got a few of the accessory parts already installed here. The reason we wanted to do a video is it's really hard in a single photograph to show how this fits on the head and basically what the system does. So the main adapter housing here, Dan, why don't you follow me around here? This goes onto the back of a Miata head. All the 1.8 and 1.6 Miata heads, basically all the 90 to 05 Miatas, all have the same sort of water outlet. Now this is a stock Miata head. This is the front where the radiator would be, and this is the back up against the firewall. Now this outlet is just for the heater, and this is actually, I call it an outlet, it's actually an inlet. The heater comes from the water pump in through the firewall, back out of the heater, and in here, and it mixes with the coolant that's in the back of the head. But there's no actual massive flow coming out here. So what we do is we actually remove this, and you can see these bosses here that fits onto the back of the head like so. Now what that does is it allows all the coolant that normally would come in through the front of the engine and then back out the front of the engine, it allows it to exit the rear, and we actually block off the front. So that's why we call it a reroute. So instead of the coolant going in the front and then back out the front, it goes in the front and out the rear. The reason this is important is that on any inline four-cylinder engine, they're always designed to have coolant come in one end and out the other end. And as you would imagine, that scavenges all the heat really well. All the coolant mass goes through all of the ports around the top of the combustion chambers and scavenges it out. The problem with the Miata, and the reason they all overheat, the coolant comes in the front, back out the front. It comes in basically through the block underneath the number one cylinder, and then out the front of the head through this port right here. And the problem is it doesn't scavenge the cooling, the heat out of the back very well. It'd be like if this was full of water and you were pouring cold water here and trying to get the old water out. The really best way to do it is to pour it in here and put a hole here, and it flows through. So you don't really get good scavenging because it's coming in here and out through there, and you get a little bit of turbulence, which will get some of the coolant here. But what ends up happening is that number 4 cylinder always runs much hotter than the number 1 cylinder. So you'll always see long-term wear on a 1.8 Miata engine without a reroute, that the number 4 cylinder is really, really worn. It's got very bad compression. The valves are more worn just because it's running 10, 20, 30 degrees hotter all the time. The other thing is all of that heat that's coming up out of the head, it doesn't all get pulled out. You're only pulling the heat out of the front. So all of the total heat doesn't reach the radiator, and you can't cool the engine if all the heat isn't actually getting to the radiator. So that's what the reroute fixes. So this engine, as it was originally designed back in the 80s, it was a B6 single cam engine, was in a front drive car, and of course the coolant went in one side and went out the back. When they stuck it in the Miata, let's go over here and look at the car for a second. What Mazda did, and we're really grateful that they did, is they tried to shove the engine towards the back of the car as much as possible. And in order to do that, they had to eliminate the outlet, and they didn't want that hose extending to the front. So they put the outlet on the front of the engine. So that is why the Miata has its coolant leaving the front from the factory and has that poor coolant flow. And you can see they put a little dimple in the firewall there. And also it's partly, and this is a little confusing, but it's the way these cars are made. You're familiar with the term roller skate. When any production car is made, you've got the subframe and the chassis and the engine and all that sitting on a production line, and the body gets lowered down over it. And if you have a lot of stuff sticking out there, the body tends to clang against it as they lower the body over the engine for assembly at the factory. So they don't have anything sticking out on the back of the engine. Us tuners, we're okay with tight confines, and you can see Dan's trying to get the camera down there. It's really hard to see, and that's why we did this video, because you can't really see where the reroute goes. So we'll go back over here and look at the reroute, and I'll show you how this thing goes together. So first of all, I want to look at the inside, all this pretty 3D machining we have here. If you notice, there's machine marks all the way down inside of there. And I'm going to spin this thing over, and you can actually look, there's machining inside through this port. So the tools actually go down through here, and through here. The idea there is to make this as large an area as possible and reduce any sharp edges so that the flow is as high velocity as possible. And what we've learned, simply put, with any cooling system, the faster you can move that coolant mass through the head, through the tubes and through the radiator itself, the better heat rejection you'll have. There's no point at which it's too fast until it cavitates. When you're pushing the water through so quickly that you're actually getting air bubbles in it, that's a bad thing. So that's another reason to get rid of sharp edges. So this is very carefully engineered. We went through a lot of iterations to get this to work the way we want. So anyway, that's showing the inside. Now this is the cover for the thermostat. This is our super stant. This is a stant high flow thermostat. Basically has some notches in it. So when the element opens very slightly, and you can't really see it in this video, but there's some little extra grooves in there. It opens up more surface area more rapidly than a standard thermostat. These cost a little bit more, but we use these in our system. So this is a 195 degree thermostat. This is designed, we found that the engine makes its best power just below 200 degrees, not 180. The reason to put 180 in is if your car's overheating and you're really desperate to keep it cool, but if you have one of these, you don't need it. 195 is where the BPs make their best power regardless of the fuel. 195, 200, so we try to keep them there. So that's why this is a 195 thermostat. Only fits in one way, as you can see. So that drops in there. We have a stainless circlip that holds it in place. And you see there's a big bypass hole there. So if you have no heater in the car, you'll still have enough coolant flow when the engine is cold to keep everything working fine and not spring leaks. So once that's assembled and locked in there, this cover sits on there. Spin this around. You see there's a little port there for your coolant temp sensor. See how you have a little cavity for it, and that's a bleed port. 3 little bolts hold it on, and that sits on the back of the head. And essentially sits on there like that. So the coolant comes out the back of the head, out this nipple, and around to the radiator. Now this is your OEM coolant temp sensor. Now we moved it from here to here so that you wouldn't have to extend the wiring harness. Unlike some other reroutes that relocate this over to this side of the engine, you have to cut the harness and open it up, and it's never a good thing to open up a sensor harness if you don't have to. This little guy here is a bleed port, and we'll show you later on in this video. We'll have a little an insert that shows the bleeding process. Essentially, there's another high spot on the back of the head, so when the system pressurizes, if you open this little bleed screw, it'll let any air that's trapped in the system bleed out of this. And 2 of the tools that we recommend for this are 3/16 PVC or vinyl hose that sits on there, and you can run that into a generic brake bleeder bottle like you would find from Winding Road Racing, or you can find them on Amazon, Rock Auto, wherever you can find these things. Or you can just make your own, obviously. But this is nice. It's got the little magnet on it so it stays put. Or you can just find a piece of hose, or you can just let the water dribble out. I mean, especially if it's a race car and it's just straight water, before you add your water wetter and your antifreeze and stuff, you just run a straight water. It's pretty harmless, just a little bit of water dribble out there, and you can just monitor whether it's got air bubbles coming out or not. So the next is I'm going to show you the covers that we have. Now for the front of the head, when it leaves the factory, it has this guy on it. Whether it's a 1/6 or 1/8, they're slightly different. I have that upside down, don't I? Let's do it this way here. It sits basically like this. Sits on there. So that's the standard water neck that you see popping out from the front of your timing cover, and this goes over to the radiator. So 2 options you have with the reroute system. Now standard, that's where your thermostat is. That's the way it leaves the factory. Right? I got that backwards. That leaves the factory like so. So the coolant comes in through the water pump, up through the head, and back out the front. So we're getting rid of this and exiting out of the back of the head. So what we could do is we offer a block-off plate. Now here you can put, this is a 1/8 MPT port for auxiliary sensors. If you have coolant pressure or coolant temp sensor and you want to have one here and have the OEM in the back. This is another port for an OEM sensor that's there on some cars, fan switch I believe. So you can run it this way, or you can take this thing completely off. This is a good thing if you're doing a water pump. At the same time you're doing a reroute, you would have the timing cover, the belts, and everything all torn off the front of the engine, and this is exposed. Well, then you can put this little plate on. This also comes with the kit, so you get basically 2 of these. One of these becomes a really cool key fob / desk paperweight. This is just a nice cleaner setup. There's no plus or minus, pro or con, one way or the other. Simply, this is cleaner, and it gets rid of this guy just hanging out in the front of the engine, not doing anything. If you have these on there, you can block these off. This goes through the throttle body and goes around to, gosh, I forget where this goes to. This goes back around to the water pump, doesn't it?
The water pump T, yeah.
Yeah, it's a water pump T. It's basically it's a pressure bypass that allows this to go through the the throttle body. A lot of high performance builds get rid of the, look at this flash here, casting flash here, gets rid of the throttle body thing. So what we do on ours is basically tap this. You can just pull this out, it's just pressed in, and just put a 1/8 MPT plug and just thread it in there and it'll plug that off. Or you can put an AN fitting. The good thing to do here, if guys who want to do a turbo feed, you can actually feed your turbo here if you got a water cooled turbo. So this is one place to get your coolant from, but it is getting hotter coolant, but it's going to be cooler than the turbo. So that's a topic for another video. So you understand how these work, what your options are there. We've shown how the adapter fits on the back of the head. There's a couple other tools here. I'm going to zoom in on this, Dan, you can show this part number here. So the brand here is Lisle. It's Lisle, and this is the part number. This is a cool little widget we use. These are about 25 bucks on Amazon. It's a funnel that's got a cap adapter, and this fits the stock radiator. So this is a standard. They come with a couple different adapters, and this fits a standard radiator. And I'll put this in here. This seals it. Actually goes this way. So when you thread it on, it's sealed, and then you drop the funnel over it, and you basically have kind of like a bleeder system. So you fill this up, and if it starts to run low, you can just leave the water sitting on top of here, and as the system burps, if it gets an air bubble, it'll push the fluid up and come back down, so it keeps you from getting air in the system and keeps from making a mess. So don't absolutely have to have this. This makes it handy. This, I think, is a good tool to have in any DIY mechanics repair parts arsenal. Just to have this little thing. I said they're cheap. It's a good thing to have. Don't absolutely need it to do the reroute, but it makes the job easier. And again, this is something you can either make or buy. What's this? What does it say? Brakeman? One-man bleeder bottle. But this is a pretty generic kind of item. Everybody makes their own version of this, and these are also very cheap. They're like 15, 18 bucks. And this is obviously great for brakes too. Bottle. So I want to talk a little bit more about the cross flow and the basic layout and why this is the way it's done, the way it is. The cross flow. This is a cross flow radiator. Now we also offer the standard downflow, which is like an OEM configuration. You'll notice the inlet here for the cross flow is moved over. We had to do that, but it also is a benefit if you've got intercooler tubing or an intake where you've got a big intake hose right here. On a standard radiator, the inlet is moved over here somewhere, so when you cut your hose, you would simply run it underneath the throttle body and it would come up here. But in any case, one thing about this hose, when you do cut it, the hose, when it gets hot, the silicone hose expands much more than a rubber hose does. So it'll actually move out a little bit. It gains about 1 to 2 inches in length when it's hot. It does not contract, so when it's cold, you cut it for the right size, just knowing that it's going to push out a little bit. So if you have something, if it's constrained really tight right here, it's going to want to push out somewhere. You want to give it some room to grow. Like here, this can grow out here, which is what it'll do. It'll push out into here, and when it's hot, it'll move out another ½ inch or so. Not a big deal, but you want to make sure you allow for that. So the hose, I don't know if I can reach down in there, but just to show you how the bleeder hose would go once it's on the car. You would go like so, and you would have your bleeder bottle set up here, and you would run the car, and you would see the water come out. The nice thing about doing it this way is that it's easier to see the air bubbles. If you don't have the hose, it's a little harder to see, but you can actually see the air coming through. And once it basically stops getting air bubbles, it'll stop coming out here when the engine's idling, because you won't build pressure as long as you have a pressure relief on. So the water will just kind of come up and stop, and you go like, well, I guess it's bled. Without this, we'll have the bleeding procedure in the instructions. Go to 949racing.com, or you can Google Qmax 949 Racing, and you will come to that item page. It's kind of hard to get down in there.
Yeah.
You can see the little below the Supermiata logo, that little plug there. That's another auxiliary port. We have several auxiliary ports in this, so if you want to add a coolant pressure sensor like we like to run on our enduro and race cars, that's the bleed nipple. So there's extra ports, and then those plugs come with it. So if you don't use it, you just put the plug in. Every place that you've got a fastener or a seam, you are going to use the supplied Permatex 22071 water pump sealant. It's a very easy to use sealant. It cleans off very easily. You can just apply it with your fingers, and put a little bit on the threads and drop that thing in there. These are all MPT fittings, which means the threads, instead of being parallel, they're tapered. So as you tighten it, it kind of wedges into place. So if you get crazy torquing it, you basically wedging the metal out and you'll crack the housing. So it's not, some of these, they don't bottom out. If you'll notice well, you probably can't see it here, but that 5/8 hose barb, it's kind of hard to see. It's not bottomed out. You can see some threads remaining. That is tight. So that went in until it got snug, and then John stopped torquing it. So it's not a fitting where well, geez, it's not bottomed out. I need to keep going. Well, if you keep doing it, you'll split the housing open, and then you got to buy another housing, so which you don't want to have to do. So just a little note for MPT fittings. So 949racing.com. If you have any more questions, you can go to email info@949racing.com. And as I was going to say earlier, on the website, on the product page, you can download the instructions, which cover in more detail than we can do in this video. Just as a backup, there's pictures of the actual installation and the whole procedure, plus the bleeding procedure. So you can download the instructions there. I think that's about it. Did we miss anything, Dan?
Well, good.
That's it. We will see you at the track.